offer a different perspective. Until a few months ago, I worked for over 3 years as a customer support guy for a very big company, which I won't name because it will just make things troublesome. Essentially, I was either the guy you would call when your stuff broke or the guy you would call when you wanted to buy stuff, but had questions. So I have both technical support and sales support experience. The reason I stopped working was because the project was closed and several hundred people were left without a job. We were given a modest exit package, and for Romania that was actually okay. It let me go YouTube full time. Because of it, I am doing what I love, and I am a part of the community that I love, regardless of the state Blizzard is in. With this being said, I don't feel sorry for those 100 people, especially since they chose to leave. I do feel a bit sorry for those that remained, because their job can't be easy now. Working some years in call centers, whenever a big chunk of people would leave or a department closed, the work volume would have to be transferred to another department. Blizzard's Cork office hasn't been closed yet, so it's a very possible case that all those calls for support will go to an office lacking at least 100 people. Now, clearly those 100 had different jobs, different positions, but they all dealt with a certain work volume, which now is being redistributed to either the remaining staff, which I tend to believe, or transferred to a different office around the world. On this subject, Blizzard confirmed Cork will not be closing, but then again they said 2019 is going to have Heroes of the Storm in esports. Same company that hoped and planned to some extent, again allegedly, to have Diablo 4 announced at BlizzCon. And we all know how this all turned out. Regardless of what happens to the office in Ireland, this whole procedure can mean a few things. And I refrain from calling it as I think it is because I am a third party. I have no clue what the actual goings on are, and I don't like to talk out of my ass. The first thing that many have already guessed, and I would stake my 2 cents on it, is that this was done to reduce costs. It's probably the most obvious thing, but it also has a lot more to it. Of course, the Q4 report is due. Also, reducing the cost is all fine and dandy, but how are the costs reduced? By reducing the personnel? No, the workflow won't magically decrease to accommodate a smaller staff, which means they are either planning to close the Ireland office in 2019 little by little, or little by little again, trying to outsource their customer support to cheaper workforce. And Romania is one country known to have a relative cheap workforce, so I kinda know how this could play out. And even for us in Romania, we are not the cheapest workforce. And what happened in my case is that after we all got laid off, and laid off is a strong word, that's not actually what happened, the work volume went to an outsourcing company in Greece. Another option they have is hire new people, since it's cheaper to pay junior customer agents than senior ones. And whichever option they go with, you can expect the overall quality of their customer support to drop. And I know what you're thinking. What customer support? But the real question should be, will this trend extend to more Blizzard departments? It has been known for quite a while that one of Blizzard's focus is to reduce costs across the board. Customer support is one thing, because if they make working games, they don't need customer support, in theory. But I'm hoping to not see this trend going to game development. Also, I wanted to stress one point, and again, this is my, and Marcellian's to some extent, point of view. Activision isn't some evil slave driver, and Blizzard their bitch. And seeing people put Blizzard in the innocent corner bothers me. Blizzard is pretty much to blame for its current image and PR. It has clear influences from Activision, sure, but when you say Activision ruined Blizzard, you're taking away from the agency Blizzard has in all of this. You're taking away the necessity of them taking responsibility in turn, at least in front of its customers. That means us. I am buying Blizzard. If Blizzard cannot keep their shit together, keep their name together, then steadily they will lose my support and my money, probably in reverse order. And of course, following this story, the Blizzard is dead train is back in the station. This is another phrase I have difficulty swallowing. Saying Blizzard is dead in today's context means that the Blizzard you came to know and love is no more. But here I ask you, what Blizzard would that be? The Blizzard that made The Lost Vikings? That Blizzard changed later on when they made Diablo and games like Warcraft 2, where they started introducing online play. But that's a Blizzard I fell in love with. That Blizzard changed probably around Cataclysm, when they started sacrificing depth and difficulty for their games to promote accessibility. But then again, that Blizzard made Legion and StarCraft 2, one of my favorite games of all time. And also, that Blizzard changed as well, most notably and publicly in 2018 with the BlizzCon announcement. This is just a very rough estimation. So saying Blizzard is dead might be correct, but without specifying context, it stands lacking in relevancy. I doubt Blizzard will die, as in all games cease to attract players and they will become the future mobile company. However shitty it sounds, the negative publicity is the best thing we have going for us. If indeed Activision or upper Blizzard management is trying to market their games towards profit at the expense of gameplay, the negative publicity is going to bite them in the butt. Because the saying, "there's no such thing as negative publicity," is full of shit in the corporate world, especially today, and the stocks confirm this more or less. Whichever direction the company is going towards, one thing is true. Every fuck up, every bad PR is biting them so hard they cannot afford to bleed anymore. And the blood they are leaking is us. In a gaming world dominated economically by companies that view live play and microtransactions to be the key to success, we have titans that stand and overthrow them. Titans such as Witcher 3 and God of War, both games that have won the Game of the Year award. There are of course a lot more games, single-player games, games with no game store for you to sink your money in, games that have proven that with passion, hard work, and a freaking open mind to what gamers actually like, can achieve so much more. I have always liked Blizzard's storytelling, and until recently I found it very hard to compete with. I have recently finished the God of War story. I won't go into a discussion over what's better, but if God of War taught me something, is that the story Blizzard tells in WoW lacks heart. We had this in Warcraft 3, StarCraft, a story that gripped you by the balls the entire playthrough. But I just feel that Blizzard themselves have taken their own universe, their own characters for granted, and I'm secretly hoping that the Azshara story will do her justice. But what have you guys played over Christmas? WoW? Or maybe some fresh new blood? Let's try and talk about the good stuff in gaming, and maybe, just maybe, it might rub off on Blizzard in the future. Thanks for watching the video and for your continuous support. This will probably be the last video for this year, but don't hold your breath because
I'll be back.
We are coming back strong in 2019 because World of Warcraft is a monster Blizzard created, a monster that even they, despite their continuous efforts, cannot kill so easily. Take care everyone and have a happy new year!
It's 10 days. 10 days.
Exciting. Now, before we get into it, after a few delays, the art for this month's Patreon finally arrived. It is very nice. We've got our festive Yeti, we've got our, well, you know, festive scene, and you can get this stuff over on the Patreon as well as a bunch of other things. So, a big thank you to them, and in these, you know, sort of odd, troubling times for YouTube, their support means a great deal. Okay, let's get into it. So, with Tides of Vengeance being such a large topic, I think the first thing Q&A and what was covered. So, Tides of Vengeance has had a sort of troublesome launch. To cut a long story short, it does not have a wealth of content, and a number of its core changes went unexplained. Now, this at worst has led to quite a lot of anger, but more commonly with the community, to me, it seems like it's just failed to re-engage the people who are feeling apathetic towards the game. Now, this was probably not expected when this Q&A was penciled into Ian's schedule, but it absolutely is what he had to deal with when he did the Q&A. So first, the topic of communication. And I think the best way to talk about communication is through the stuff that he addressed. Now, the Mythic Plus Keystone deletion, that was a result of their hotfix to the bug where Legion Keystone progress continued into BFA, and that gave people really silly Mythic Plus keys. So, Blizzard hotfixed in the ability to delete and reroll keys to solve that problem, but they just did not think about the unintended consequences where it essentially let people be really picky about what keys they wanted to do. Now, this was changed because of those Legion launch problems. They don't seem to have thought that much about it, but it obviously led to all of these, just led to the community things where people would just say, oh, Seth Rallis? Nah, in the bin. And much of this stems from, I would say, the trash and stuff like that of the current dungeons being harder than that of Legion. Now, what Ian said is that they are actually working on balancing hotfixes, especially on trash, that are aimed at fixing up damage spikes. Overall, I think that's pretty great, and, if that was the main highlight, they could have done this as a positive, because imagine if, weeks ago, they had have said, look guys, we're going to prevent you from deleting keystones, but at the same time, we're going to retune dungeons to solve problems that made you want to re-roll your keys. They could have actually done that, and had it be sold as a positive, but instead, because they've had to do it now and be reactive and, allowed it to play into the narrative of them having bad communication, well, it didn't work out. So, it's odd. It's like something that totally could have been a PR win ended up being a PR loss because of a lack of foresight. Next, artifact knowledge. So Blizzard said that this was always intentional and that it just so happened that it lined up with the patch 8.1 release dates. Now, Ian did admit that that sounds a little bit suspicious, but he did point out that AK had caps in Legion, and that is absolutely true, and he said that because of this, he just did not think much about the change. Well, as I said in my original coverage of this, I think the main problem is the general dissatisfaction with AP progression itself in BFA, combined with the disappointment over the lack of communications. This drama would not have happened if Blizzard had, maybe in their launch notes for this expansion, said that AK will continue until a weekly cap at about a certain date. So, yeah, I think it's a pretty simple one, really. Then, as for the profession armor thing, that was a bug. It was internally treated as a bug because it was a bug-like fix that was done based on a submission from QA, and because of that, they just didn't think about the consequences. Now, it's worth noting that Ian did say that what happened with that profession gear was unacceptable. That one does seem like a genuine mistake, which of course is not ideal, and it definitely was not timing that helped them. Then there were a bunch of changes to dungeons that were made internally back in September, like with the Underroot mobs, and they basically just slipped through the cracks because they happened ages ago. So that's what Ian said, and overall, I do think a lot of that seems quite fair. It is just, though, a level of disorganization that's not good for a live surface game, and a lot of these changes should be communicated earlier. A few days back, I said that this stuff mostly seems to be the symptom of poorly functioning internal systems at the company, and almost everything that Ian said backs up that. So how could this be solved? Well, I'd say by fixing up systems. That's going to take them time to get right internally, and they say it's something that they're working on really hard, but they've said that a few times before and they have not produced the results. So I welcome what they're saying, but equally I think we need to recognize that unfortunately their intent has not always lined up with their results. Next up, Azerite. So Ian was quite frank about the current situation being frustrating, about re-unlocking traits feeling bad. Now, what's exciting is that Season 2 is going to be the last of the current style of Azerite gear because 8.2 is revamping and overhauling it. Now, this all starts with the Heart of Azeroth. Right now, it's boring as hell. So Blizzard's original plan was for the constant unlocking and re-unlocking of traits to be a parallel to how unlocking the first 36 traits of your artifact felt quite good in Legion, but for that to actually last. Well, that has not panned out, and they're pretty much abandoning it. So first, there's going to be a lot more lore and story with Magni and the Heart. Now, this is going to result in the Heart unlocking powers itself, that's where AP will be going. Then Azerite gear will drop with all traits unlocked, so that you're free to select whatever you want. Then your Heart of Azeroth level will actually still matter, though, because it will scale up the potency of your various traits. Now, we're going to have to see how all of this actually works and actually balances out. Suffice to say, I like it. I mean, it's almost exactly what I suggested months ago, just after BFA launched. So, I mean, yeah, of course I'm going to be happy about it. It's lining up with what I think they should have done from the beginning. Now, what's interesting to me is this seems to be a new direction, because their communications got to the point of lore saying that re-unlocking traits might just be a part of this system that we would have to live with for the duration of the expansion. So the fact that this is now what's happening in 8.2 makes me feel like it's a recent development, and that the dev team are feeling the pressure of feedback. Overall, for me, this seems like a general outline of Azerite that seems far better, and if 8.2 has this better Azerite, the better acquisition, better world content, it does seem like it'll be a genuinely better game. So that's most of what I think there. we don't actually have hard changes, but we know that their broad strokes, things that they want to do to Azerite, are actually quite positive. And there's actually a bit that might bode well for future expansions, because Ian essentially did say that their current mode of operation, where class development happens through an external expansion long system like the Artifact or the Azerite, he said that that is basically, it hasn't panned out to be as satisfying as the developers have intended, and that it might be something that they relook in the future. So Azerite could be the last iteration of this style of system before they move on to something different. Now, there is one point of disappointment for me, and that is that he didn't address how many, including myself, think that the class changes of 8.1 are pretty lackluster, especially for the shamans. So it's a little bit disappointing that that was wasn't covered. I know that typically they do want to talk about the broad strokes things, but in this case, I think an exception for that might have been useful. So that's the super important stuff, but let's quick fire through the rest. Now, the cross-realm RP add-on that was broken due to the changes, that essentially happened because those changes needed to happen for security reasons, but Blizzard do intend to add an elixir that will let people understand the opposite faction in an RP realm. So if an Alliance and Horde RP guild wants to do a scene together, they can all use that elixir. Next, on the topic of repeatable residuum, basically they said that it's there for Mythic plus Azerite acquisition, and that they know that if it was like repeatable and farmable, people will just farm themselves crazy. Now, also on that topic, the currency values for costs and earnings will basically 10x with Season 2. So the idea is that it's not really efficient to save up, but you still kind of can if you want to, even though you're not going to get a massive amount of benefit. For the team, it just means they don't have like 4 different currencies, like, you know, one for every season. Overall, I think a pretty good way of doing it. Then they also talked about seasons and war fronts. So each war front is actually mostly tied to a season. So in Season 2, Darkshore rewards will be bumped up by 1%, but Stromguard ones will not. Blizzard's intent is that you can still do Stromguard if you would like to, but just like how Dazara lore makes Uldir less important, Darkshore in Season 2 makes Stromguard less important. So I guess that kind of means that Stromguard will exist for AP, Transmog, and Alt Catch-Up, but they don't really intend for mains to be fully participating in every single Warfront cycle. Now, there is one exception, and that is Heroic Mode. That is actually going to be available for both Warfronts in 8.2, I believe, and they will scale in terms of difficulty. So you'll be able to do both Warfronts on Heroic Mode and get relevant gear. Moving on to that, we actually have a nice development for the Vicious PvP mounts. So in Season 2, your mount bar will actually be refillable after you complete it the first time, and each time you refill it, you will get a Vicious saddle. So that gives people, a good way to farm out those Vicious mounts if they want, instead of being one per season, which I think is great. Overall, as a Q&A, it's a challenging time for World of Warcraft. It's going to be hard for them to claw back from this. The Azerite stuff was very positive. A little bit disappointed in the class changes. There were 1 or 2 times where Ian was explaining a philosophy that, at the end of the day, I kind of just don't really agree with that much. But overall, I think it was actually a very solid, a very good Q&A. I do wonder that if on some of those philosophical issues, that they might sort of change their mind over time, much like how they clearly have changed their tune when it comes to Azerite, and potentially even to the external class development reward systems like Azerite itself, just as a concept for the game. So overall, quite positive. But we do need to take a little bit of a turn into the strange territory of store mounts, because Blizzard have released the next store mount. As always, it's gorgeous, it's unique, it's really well designed, and it absolutely is one of the highest quality mounts in the mount roster. And that's kind of the problem. The in-game mounts that are available through, gold and other things, they tend to just be regular zone creatures with a saddle slapped on them. Now, don't get me wrong, many of them are lovely, like the new frog of 8.1, but it is the case that they don't have as much unique work being put into them. Now, that kind of does make sense. The store mounts are a license to print money, so of course they're going to, put that effort where it gets the most return. Now, I think that the player reaction to store mounts is actually a very solid measure of general sentiment towards the game. If the game is doing well with lots of content, people do not mind store mounts. But if the game is doing poorly, as with Warlords of Draenor and its store mounts, then yeah, they're not well received at all. Now, there's really not a massive amount to read into this, to be honest with you. The world of Warcraft is in a pretty mixed state. Blizzard have not had positive headlines. Therefore, people are going to be less accepting of additional asks from the company, such as from this. Now, WoW Token does make this a little bit more interesting, because as many have pointed out, it is a good bit better now that you can just convert gold into purchase the amount. On a surface level, I agree, that is a bit better. However, I think it's a nice aside. I don't think it's really the core of the issue. At the end of the day, if this was the prevailing logic, then why bother putting it on the store when you could just have it be in-game for the cost of 5 tokens worth of gold, because that would be enough to get about the same profit. The truth is, the store mount framing makes it stand out, and that framing comes along with the mounts being of exceedingly high quality. As for my take, I don't like the store mount stuff, and I think that that content would do more good if it was in the game. However, some quick napkin maths does show that it's a business no-brainer, and Token is a mitigating factor towards it. Much of this would be helped if Blizzard had a wider range of in-game mounts that were of a similar quality, but doing so is hard because reusing this model and rig erodes the uniqueness of the store mount, and therefore burns the people who bought the store mount. I think what's more important to all this is optics. This was just the wrong time to release a mount. Now, it almost certainly was planned far in advance. And knowing that is fine, but it doesn't change how dissatisfied people will feel. Releasing it now is just terrible optics for Blizzard, and I think it would have been wise to bump those earnings back into the same quarter as Rise of Ashara. Blizzard are just often, honestly, terrible at playing their hand, and much of it seems to stem from them being a large corporation that has proven itself to be inflexible. Next, we've got to move on to the sad but not entirely unexpected news of the essential gutting of Heroes of the Storm. Blizzard have announced that elements of the dev team are being moved over to unannounced projects and that the game's esports ecosystem is being cancelled. It's flat out being cancelled. The HGC and Heroes of the Dorm will not return in 2019. And that's not a surprise to me. Heroes of the Storm is a perfectly fine game, but I don't think it's one that people really asked for. It came into the market quite late, after the incumbents had established their dominance over the market. Heroes actually started off as a StarCraft 2 mod that basically they liked so much that they decided to make it into a full game. And I've got to wonder if that decision making was just a bit carried away. Perhaps, they really just wanted that MOBA dollar and they were frustrated over letting Dota slip from their grasp. Because Heroes, it never really had a large esports scene, it didn't pull in large viewership numbers, and Blizzard were just pumping resources into it in their attempt to non-organically create an esports scene. Contrast that with StarCraft 2, wherein Blizzard followed the third-party orgs instead of trying to build the ecosystem 100% themselves. Looking at Overwatch, I worry that the Overwatch setup is really fragile, because they pretty much purchased MLG and then decided that they would have a big esports scene for the game. Now, the popularity of Overwatch allowed for that to work, where it didn't work for Heroes, but it does make you wonder how financially efficient the Overwatch operation is, and how healthy it's going to be once the growth continues to slow down, because it is slowing. For me, it's not surprising. I think it was a self-indulgent game that people didn't really ask for, though I'll happily admit, it was decently fun, and it had a lot of polish to it. A lot of love went into it. Ultimately, though, it probably doesn't make sense to put that many resources into it in comparison to other things. And this is where it gets tricky. We know Blizzard has multiple unannounced games, and the community is particularly focused on the mobile ones. So the timing of this announcement feeds into the current prevailing narrative that Blizzard is a company that is disconnected from the desires of its customers and that it's shifting resources over to mobile. Much like with the store mounts, it's bad optics for Blizzard. There's just no denying that. Now, the other really bad part of this that basically does just go against one of Blizzard's mission statements is just how they did not do it deftly. So that big, unsustainable esports scene that seemingly had everything bar strong viewership? Well, Blizzard just pulled funding from the whole thing, and that means that many teams and support staff and just everything involved with the scene, everyone involved with the scene, they're now out of a job. That sucks. And the way that they dropped it on people really sucks. They essentially led teams on, saying that it would continue. I know that people were reporting that in BlizzCon, or during BlizzCon, people were saying that HGC and stuff will be returning in 2019, and they're just ironing out the details. So they did string on a lot of people, and then they axed it. And when you compare that, look at, say, their moral policy thing that's on their site. Yeah, guys, You really did go against the core value there. You really messed up how you announced this and how you took care of the people who, you kind of led down this bizarre road with. You kind of owed it to those people to do this bit right, and you definitely didn't do it right. Really, to me, though, it's just clear that Blizzard was not getting a strong return on the esports scene for this game, but their willingness to take the leap of cutting it, that could be because of the Activision influence. We recently covered Jason Schreier's article on, the new information about Blizzard, their new CFO from Activision, their drive to reduce costs, and their drive to ship more games, and their mobile segment, and then, of course, the whole Diablo debacle. Well, cutting Heroes Esports and moving developers onto other products, that's absolutely in line with the goal of cutting costs and shipping more products. Perhaps the Blizzard of years back wouldn't have done it in this way, but the modern Blizzard that now faces more corporate oversight certainly does seem to be willing to. Now, I suppose as a fan of StarCraft, it does make me a bit worried, but it does seem like the StarCraft audience does actually tune in for events, and unlike with Heroes, StarCraft has a more healthy third-party scene. I doubt the Home Story Cup will ever be as flashy as the WCS Finals, but at the end of the day, I don't care about flashy lights, I don't care about all of your casters pretending they're big fancy boys with sports jackets, I'm just there to watch good games. I mean, I guess it is just kind of cringy when they pump so much money into trying to emulate something like the traditional sports scene that many gamers actually just don't give a toss about. Now, next, there was some talk from the actual dev team themselves, and essentially it seems like they had so much in the works, and they really felt like they were hitting their stride, and they're really sad. They said they would be continuing, lower content cadence though, and I just do wonder how many of the changes teased at BlizzCon will actually make it in. And, is this game going to be going on support mode? Or is it going to, maybe free from its esports demands, going to be a game that's more tailored towards the audience who actually plays it? It's hard to know, but yeah, there you go. I mean, man, the major headlines have just been a goddamn walloping for Blizzard over the last week. As for the WoW people, it is mixed. I'm genuinely excited to see where Azerite goes now that Ian has said that Season 2 is going to be the last incarnation of like the current Azerite system. But equally, I'm not happy about the Stormount. Like, it's not a great thing to have happen. And, 8.1, it does add some good things. It also doesn't really do a lot to, counter the apathy. So overall, it's very mixed. But I suppose the one bit of news today, which is the Azerite one, that is giving us, an indication of the future, that is actually quite good. And it does go along with other good indications about patch 8.2. So because of that, I'm personally thinking that we might have a pretty dull 4 months for World of Warcraft, unless you're enjoying Dazara lore, which seems awesome. But there is a chance that for Nazjatar, things actually could be quite rosy. Like if we have a really good progression system, if we have a revamped style of world content, it could actually be a lot better than what we have now. And I'm not saying that you should get a 6-month sub and stick with it until that happens. Maybe it is right for you to take a few months of a break and then to see if Blizzard are able to do it. But it just does seem like they know that 8.2 is their, it's their response. 8.1 is too close to the launch of BFA to do massive changes to the game. But 8.2 is far enough along the line that new designs can be developed in response to things that happened at that stage about 8 months prior. So that's my thoughts on that and my thoughts on World of Warcraft. I'm considering doing a video broadly talking about 8.1 and whether it might actually be able to feel like more of an expansion than the BFA launch, which in some ways actually felt like a bit of a contraction. So let me know what you think about all this stuff down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you want to check out all that really cool Patreon art, then the link is also down there. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.
From 2007 through 2011, MMORPG releases were common enough to be quarterly.
Welcome to Hello Kitty's massively multiplayer online game.
It was hard just keeping up with the games, let alone trying to play them all to some capacity. Alas, I was a young kid with not much else being interesting to me at the time, and set the timeline to 2011, SWTOR was set to launch at the end of the year. The game that I had been most anticipating ever. A game that, well, you guys know my thoughts on. Earlier in the year, there was yet another major MMORPG to launch. Heroes of Telara. No. Rift. Plains of Telara. No. Rift. As it more recently and prominently has been known for. Rift was Tryon Worlds' first MMORPG. Former EA VP turned Tryon Worlds founder and CEO Lars Butler stated it was to feature the most complete, full-featured and dynamic online game they've ever experienced. Lars' words for, at the time, a fledgling company. But Tryon had high hopes with Rift. Rift boasting a public event system dubbed Rifts that was meant to capture the hype and success around Warhammer's online public quests or Tabula Rasa's invasions as a crowning feature of its game. Despite these features and the CEO's lofty promises, however, Rift never could quite set its feet for very long in its journey post-launch, quickly losing its immense levels of success before transitioning to free-to-play. Rift still exists in 2018, but as recent reports have shown, is essentially in a maintenance mode where quality of life changes are all about the dev team can muster. What went wrong with Tryon Worlds' first MMORPG, Rift, and why was it never quite able to maintain its earlier levels of success? On this episode of Death of a Game, we will investigate the rise and fall of Rift. Tryon Worlds, on the other hand, that's for another time. Another mystery to solve, so make sure to pay attention to the clues along the way. But if you get lost, I will open up my journal near the end to fill you guys in. And of course, at the end of the video, there is a clue pertaining to what the next Death of a Game will be on. Oh, and one more thing, detectives. We're not in Azeroth anymore. Rift's story being Tryon Worlds' first project as a company starts at the same time that Tryon Worlds forms as a company. First dubbed Tryon World Network in 2006 by Lars Butler, who was previously a VP at the notorious Electronic Arts, or EA. Lars was joined by John Van Kingaham, who had previously served as executive producer at NCSoft. So right off the bat, Tryon took two powerful video game executives who came from companies often referred to as more so interested in business than maybe what some would call art, NCSoft and EA. Both being publicly traded companies and only have business guys essentially at the top who are interested in turning yet more profit. That's because, well, if they don't, then their shareholders get pissed and they get fired from their company, or their company possibly gets wrenched from them. This is an interesting clue to me, because when thinking of Tryon Worlds of recent, it's quite easy to see them for their more aggressive means of monetization. But I often wondered in retrospect, maybe Tryon was always so business focused from the very beginning. And well, I think telling the rest of my story will answer that question. Immediately following the company's formation, they began work on an unnamed MMORPG. A mere 3 years later, and Tryon World Network, as they were still known by at the time, showcased a trailer at E3 announcing that their MMORPG in development would be titled Heroes of Telara. Heroes of Telara, as the old wiki stated, was a high fantasy setting with dwarves, elves, humans, and goblins. Wait a minute, that sounds familiar. Okay, so Heroes of Telara was sort of generic fantasy bordering on WoW clone in some views. But still, as the trailer showcased some gameplay and in-game locations, the game certainly looked like it wasn't an amateurish project. If anything, it's oddly similar in look to another failed MMORPG, Vanguard Saga of Heroes. We also know the game was set to have a system that sounds oddly similar to what it later became known as, in Rift, the Soul system, which is essentially the ability to change your subclass relatively easily and possibly combine these subclasses together. The game was also set to have over 4 factions for PvP, which is certainly interesting in retrospect. What was also significant about the project was actually its technology. Tryon had partnered with none other than tech giant HP, and as Russ Brown explained in the interview in June, just a month after Tryon announced Heroes of Telara, their technology would afford them the ability to have dynamic events and scripted events without having to actually patch someone's client, which allowed for them to be more dynamic in the way that they could create events. This of course was relevant looking back because this was the first inklings of what Tryon had in store for their first MMORPG. Now it's easy to speculate that Tryon World Network wasn't really satisfied with Heroes of Telara's showing at E3 and went back to the drawing board, or simply perhaps got more money or further developed their idea. And a little over a year, they showcased themselves yet again, this time at Gamescom, and this time labeled Rift: Plains of Telara. Lars Butler and company CEO stated that Rift would have a budget of $50 million. This was quite impressive for a fresh company in Tryon Worlds, but where was this company getting this money from, pre-revenue? Turns out Lars Butler had raised $100 million and was using this to fund 3 different projects simultaneously. Rift of Plains Telara, End of Nations, an MMORPG, and finally an unnamed project announced in conjunction with the TV channel Sci-Fi that was later known as Defiance. That's awfully aggressive for a new company. Although Tryon Worlds had yet to launch a product yet, they had veteran leadership who were particularly good at navigating the corporate space, and most importantly, how to get funding. Funding always comes with a price far greater than the monetary value assigned to it, however. It often comes with a loss of control as investors step in. They want assurances that they can get their money back. They expect a percent of your company and often create a board of trustees that can effectively vote out the CEO, in this case, the founder of the company. This happens quite often and is a strong reason why you have seen AAA MMORPGs die overnight. Investors might not be so willing to give a game a couple of years of work if they don't think it will fit their ROI. This is always one of the first clues I look for when investigating these games, because when you start spending other people's money, that's when there's some dire consequences. Rift would now be focusing on its 2 factions and a Rift mechanic that looked to emulate and innovate in ways the public questing systems in Warhammer Online pioneered, and the same system that finds itself now in just about every MMO on the market.
We are the first game that has a true kind of dynamic system.
Right.
And if you're not careful, basically the world gets attacked. We have these things called tears. Tears are where the veil between our plane and the next is a little light. And so there are warnings. This is a tear right here. Let's see if I can get up there. This is a tear right there. I'm going to get on one of my ponies. And you'll get a warning that you're about to be invaded. You'll go up, you can go play with that. If you ignore them though, you will get invaded. And things will change and monsters will attack you.
Now surely Russ uses a little bit of hyperbole here, considering Tabula Rasa and Warhammer Online had done such events years before, but he uses the word true to imply that because their tech is actually dynamic, then their world is therefore the more dynamic world. Forgive Russell, he worked for 6 years at EA. It's actually a brilliant idea. This makes players have to band together to stop this threat from occurring, which can increase in player immersion and interactivity between players. This also keeps the world itself dynamic, as things will ebb and flow, and some areas are captured and others will be liberated. The inklings of an idea of a truly breathing world. I say inklings because, well, that's an awfully lofty goal, and one we're not quite there yet with. Rifts are also a focal point of sorts for the title, both in name and substance. This makes venturing out in the world seemingly more exciting, as you know it had a persistent threat that rewarded you for participating in game, as well as made you feel like you were making a difference in the world. And, well, not to mention, because most questing in Rift never really was that exciting in the first place. This is where Tryon's server-based technology would really thrive. They were attempting to make MMOs more dynamic in the way that people experienced content. And that's a goal I support then, and still support now. The other heavily publicized feature of Rift would be none other than its soul system, which allowed for strong variety in playstyle and class combinations. The way this function was essentially you had base classes and callings as they were dubbed in Rift, and within each calling you had a subclass, or souls as Rift dubbed them. There were roughly 5 base classes and around 8 to 10 souls for each. Each soul tree had over 60 different skill points, much like a talent system from WoW. Except in Rift, you could choose up to 3 subclasses that could potentially very much vary the styles of play greatly, even within each calling. For example, you could mix a soul from a mage and a soul from a cleric, and one from a warrior, and the next thing you know, you've got some sort of battle mage. According to the official Gamepedia, there are 336 possible class combinations, or 224 when not counting the PvP soul. This gave the game far more class combinations than most MMORPGs were boasting at the time, well, except for good old-fashioned Shadowbane. A good system, and certainly a good idea, but would balancing prove a great issue later on? Rift entered closed beta on December 3rd, 2010, featuring the first 20 levels of play. This is a momentous event for the entire Tryon team, as well as the fans that have been following Rift since we first announced the game, said Scott Hartzman, who was Rift's executive producer and Tryon's chief creative officer. He also went on to say, "We've created this deep, vibrant world that's just waiting to be populated with enthusiastic players, and our hope is that gamers will enjoy playing the game as much as we've enjoyed building it." The open beta for Rift happened just a few months later, in February of 2011. This time players can progress up to level 42 and participate in dungeons and PvP areas. And as expected, critics were lauding the class system, as well as the public quest aspect Rifts brought to the table, not to mention the gameplay which supported both facets. Things were looking good for the upcoming launch of Rift, and perhaps it could offer an alternative to the juggernaut WoW. Tryon Worlds seemed to want to be more than just an alternative to World of Warcraft, they wanted to directly compete with World of Warcraft. And so they made their ad campaign centered around the slogan, "We're not Nazaroth anymore." And this kind of is the point that I scratch my head. This sort of thing works in other markets because products are often so similar in nature, but in gaming there are so many differences between products typically. The problem with Rift is that, well, it wasn't different enough, it would end up being too similar to WoW in certain cases. The problem that if Rift wasn't different enough, it would end up being way too similar to WoW, since in many ways it was. And because it chose WoW as direct competition, this means that it would be a big blow to them, since ultimately, they marketed to WoW's audience. Rift, however, did offer unique features, and perhaps these features would be enough to differentiate their title. But it was a gamble, because if they weren't able to do it, then they would learn the painful lesson that the PC community is ruthless, especially the MMORPG audience. Now, there are certainly some clues regarding Rift that we can gather at this point. For example, the engine used to create the MMORPG was, well, none other than the now infamous Gamebryo engine. The same one featured in other videos in this series, say for example Dark Age of Camelot and Warhammer Online. And since we have the gift of hindsight, we can easily spot this as a significant clue that contributes to the failure of Rift later on. Rift was set to launch on March 1st, 2011 in the NA and 10 days later in the EU. If you pre-ordered the game, you got a 4-day head start. Rift's launch was quite successful, managing to garner a 84 on Metascore and having glowing reviews from OG websites like Tin Ton Hammer, IGN, and PC Gamer. IGN remarked about how the game was certainly similar to WoW and EverQuest, but at least added another layer to those games and possibly even innovated on the model. While us gamers lauded the Rift system in the game, seeing it as an evolved form of Warhammer's public questing. Most concluded that the soul system and combat were certainly a strong point for the game as well. Although it played similar to its competition, Rift was able to offer just enough that was unique to catch the attention of the MMORPG audience. Although Rift certainly leaned towards a more generic fantasy, it was still a pretty good looking game. Launch for Rift wasn't perfect, however.
Oh, the lag is setting in.
FPS issues in some cases made warfronts and PvP scenarios and certain Rift bosses impossible to play without slideshowing for some. I can remember testing the game myself in enclosed beta with an at the time average PC, and I couldn't even get above 20 FPS playing Rift myself. Despite the performance issues, Rift seemed to have an overall successful launch. Its commercial success followed that, and just a few months later, Senior VP David Reed hinted at in an interview that Rift had achieved over 1 million in sales and 600,000 subscriptions. These, of course, were players who had to pay a sub fee in order to play the game, since the game was a sub fee game. Not shabby for a company that previously didn't even have a wiki page. We are on the verge of selling our 1 millionth unit of Rift, David Reed, SVP of Publishing, said. We are really pleased with what we are seeing, and beyond that, it was a pleasure to see that in the latest Activision Blizzard earnings call. They inquired about Rift when Blizzard announced that their subscriber numbers went from 12 million to 11.4 million. You can do the math, we all know very well where those 600,000 people are. And when prompted about if those players would remain, since retention in subscription-based MMORPGs is always the most important stat, David Reed stated that we know that it's a very stick game. I don't think they will be getting those 600,000 people back as quick as they did from Ion, Conan, Warhammer, and the like. Tryon was confident following their 2011 launch of Rift. They were getting glowing reviews, had in just a few months sold over 1 million copies, and had managed to boast 600,000 sub players. Numbers that were certainly impressive for a fledgling MMO, let alone a AAA MMO company. That's why you can see David make sure to let people know that their ad campaign against WoW seemed to have work, and it certainly was performing better than its competition, such as the previously mentioned Ion, Conan, and Warhammer. All three of those games, however, you would think would have served as a lesson to Tryon Worlds. Those 3 games in particular, all featured on my series, are titles that have sold exceptionally well at launch, all selling over 1 million copies, but within just a year or two dropped over 50% of their populations. It's a little amusing to me when you look back in retrospect, how developers and publishers in the MMO space can be so quick to declare victory, but fail to realize that the mark of success in the MMORPG industry is not selling X amount of copies, it's consistently releasing new content that keeps your rabid fanbase in check and satisfied. Well, if you plan on doing this sort of content that Rift was able to do at least, developer-made content is a race between players and developers. If games don't maintain their content and further innovate, they can be eclipsed, and then the MMORPG audience is fleeting and surely will leave. Rift's endgame was pretty standard fare in the MMO space. It had dungeons, raids, and endgame PvP in the form of warfronts and a few open PvP zones. Rift did have an interesting enough premise to make those formulaic activities enjoyable, however. Raids, for example, certainly weren't a pushover, and there was enough room for progression level raiding in the game, 20-man raids and 10-man slivers. Raids were interesting enough to be a good enough alternative to a WoW raid in some ways. Like with most MMORPGs, it was going to be a race from launch to maintain the content your audience needs, though, in Rift's case, especially when the audience is in the several hundred thousands and they're all trying to eagerly play your content. But just having a successful MMORPG in Rift wasn't enough for Tryon Worlds. They had been working on 2 MMOs during the launch of Rift, Defiance, a sci-fi MMO, and End of Nations, another MMO. And in October 2011, even expressed interest in going public as a company. Going public essentially refers to a private company's initial public offering, or their IPO, becoming a publicly traded and owned entity. Businesses go public to raise capital in hopes of expanding like a corporation. Lars Butler, the ambitious former VP of EA, was taking no prisoners in his approach. He didn't just want a successful MMO, he wanted a stable of them. And it shouldn't serve as a surprise that just a few months later, Tryon raised another $85 million in funding. This meant that the company had raised a total of $185 million up until this point. And that kind of money comes with another kind of price tag, as we mentioned. Rift was certainly doing well. In the first 10 months of its launch, it had generated $100 million in revenue. But every time they took on more funding, this meant that they were going to lose more and more control of their company in order to further keep expanding. It can be a never-ending cycle, up until investors cut their losses and sell the company. To date, Tryon Worlds had investments from Rustic Canyon, Act 2 Capital, Time Warner, Peacock Equity, DCM, Trinity Ventures, Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, and Bertelsmann Digital Media Investments. If that sounds like a crazy amount of different random companies, that's because it is. These are a lot of different investors, all with their own competing interests. Their own money. Although Rift was able to have strong success at launch, based on the population data observed, within just 1 year of launch, it had already dropped to 250,000 active subscribers. Tryon Worlds learned the unfortunate lesson that it's indeed not a sprint, but a marathon when it comes to MMOs, and perhaps they were a bit too quick to celebrate. Likely in response to their dwindling player base, Rift announced a trial in February of 2012, but weren't promising a big expansion until later in the year. Storm Legion was the first big content update and full-blown expansion, and it launched in November of 2012. This expansion tripled the landmass of Talara, raised the level cap to 60, introduced dimensions, a form of player housing, and added additional soul choices to each class. Storm Legion also added 3 more highly anticipated raids. Though I personally think that Storm Legion was the best era of Rift, and typically most fans agree, its success weren't enough to pull Tryon Worlds out of the hole that they were slowly falling into, and frankly, the one that they dug themselves. And things weren't getting any better when in December of 2012, just a month after launching Storm Legion, Tryon Worlds laid off 37 employees. They essentially laid off the San Diego team who was working on End of Nations and relocated their Defiance dev team back to Redwood, their home base. Just 1 month later, they lost the voice of their community and executive producer, Scott Hartzman, in a highly publicized departure. Scott wrote that it was a great experience and that he was proud of where he came from. But this is where I put on my detective hat and speculate a bit. Rift announced its free-to-play launch in May of 2013. Clearly, its strong start wasn't enough to keep the game from facing the inevitable drop in players that most MMOs face within their first few months. The free-to-play announcement certainly caught people off guard, considering Rift was originally billed as a sub-based MMO. But not just build or designed, but even the SVP of publishing, David Reed, an influential voice concerning the product, took a stance that said that the subscription market is not dying. We're clearly seeing that. The MMORPG market is not declining. We believe a quality product is going to continue to be something that gamers are willing to pay for as long as we continue to run the service as we should, said Reed in an interview he did. That was just over 2 years ago. Now sure, people can change their mind, and many MMOs have gone free to play over the course of their launch, and well, many of them have boasted successful free to play launches, but once again, after the new car smell fades away, most MMOs sort of lose their new feel or look and quickly seem obsolete when compared to the more practiced and further polished MMOs. Though the biggest issue with changing your business model is it means in essence you must change your game. Rift was a game that was created to have a subscription-based business model to sustain its content. And on the surface, it seems the same. You get to play the game, Rift in this case for free, and then pay for convenience and cosmetic things. This means they have free advertising, aka more foot traffic. It also means that they can effectively monetize their game past the normal $15 monthly sub limit that a normal sub-based MMO is beholden to. Let me repeat that part. It means that they no longer are restrained by that $15 a month that you pay. It means that you could pay potentially even more money. But this ultimately changes the way the game is paced. For those who haven't had an experience of a game such as Black Desert Online, Arcade and the like, you are likely aware of how this can get quickly out of hand. Developers find ways to incentivize their free-to-play customers to pay money, and this is where the more insidious bits of work lay. In order to best incentivize people to pay money, you have to take things from them. So in most free-to-play MMOs, you have level caps, content caps, and more convenience-based restrictions. However, this can get even worse. When developers add items that can grant those who purchase it a higher power level, well, now you are approaching pay-to-win or pay-to-gain power. Free-to-play in itself is just a model, it's just a business model. It's not inherently evil or anything, and it's a viable alternative generally to those who don't want to spend a box price or a sub fee. Free-to-play MMOs have to get their revenues somehow, and it's nearly guaranteed always to be a situation where devs will slowly push towards more methods of monetization. At least in the case of Tryon Worlds, this is especially true due to their numerous investment rounds of funding. Even Scott Hartzman, when interviewed before he exited the company, stated that one of the things that free-to-play games do is make the XP grind really harsh, and you can advance all the way to the top level, but you're buying power-ups to advance at a fun rate. One of the reasons we felt so confident about having a relatively non-grindy, painless progression to level 50 was because we knew we had a healthy endgame waiting. There's a whole bunch of stuff that opens up to you once you turn level 50. Scott also admitted that they would essentially have to keep up with the dedicated raid audience, who was certainly all the bit hardcore. The point for us is to introduce people to the fact that we have the ability to keep shipping new and interesting content to play, whether they're high-end rifts, invasions, or raid zones. As long as people truly believe that there's more coming, it will continue to be fun. Our bet is that they will stick around. Whether or not they could maintain that would have to remain to be seen, but one thing was for sure, just in under 2 years of its launch, Rift was already on a downswing of sorts, even following their successful expansion launch in Storm Legion. And throughout this, Tryon Worlds in April of 2013 launched Defiance, and let's just say that that's probably the definition of a catastrophic failure.
Holy stucco.
Commercially, critically, and the like. Garbage! While End of Nation, set to launch in 2013, frankly just disappeared, and next to no updates were set of the title. So perhaps CEO Lars Butler was far too quick to aggressively expand before actually having a proven product. But fear not, Rift as it was now dubbed would not fall to such lengths as to using unfair microtransactions or pay-to-win aspects. At least that's what creative director Bill Fisher, now in charge of Rift in June of 2013, said of the business model change. We are not selling power, we are not pay to win. Every piece of stat-granted equipment that you can buy from the store can also be gained through play, he added. Our philosophy is that the very best gear in the game must be earned. Wait a minute. That made me have to reread that. We're not selling power, we're not pay to win. Every piece of stat-granting equipment that you buy from the store can also be gained through play. Gear in the game must be earned. Anyway, 2013 continues to be quite the interesting year for Rift. Although they lost Scott Hartzman, they had a successful free-to-play launch in June of 2013. It's very rare that an MMO can launch a new business model and essentially have a second life and be successful at it. And Rift seemed to be doing just that, as its free-to-play switch seemed to reinvigorate the player base as well as attract more players. But Bill Fisher, creative director and now CEO at Tryon Worlds, didn't seem to want to answer the question of the effect of why did they go to free-to-play? Was it because they were losing subs? Which, to be fair, we wouldn't expect him to be honest about that, but I'm pointing out that he doesn't answer a point-blank question concerning such, And it can't be a Death of a Game episode if there wasn't yet another twist. In August 2013, Scott Hartzman would rejoin the company, this time as CEO, while Lars Butler would be leaving the company. This usually means that the board had a talk, they thought that Scott was better suited to lead the company, and probably had a little bit better of an image, and we can speculate that this is probably because Lars ultimately overreached himself. Instead of firing you, they just suggest that you exit. They pay your shares and then hope to move on to the next person more appropriate for running a business. So yes, Tryon Worlds, a game developer, was certainly a business with many different people's money and interests. This is a very rare case where a new CEO might actually have been a good thing for a company. They can start anew of sorts, and who better to be the face of a company than, well, the guy who was kind of already the face of the company. And well, Scott all but confirmed this himself, where after being rehired, this time as CEO, he stated that we're going to rapidly be laying the groundwork for a new strategy for Tryon. One that's closer to the foundation of how we've had our wins so far, and then extending that base into the enduring success this company can and will be. Sure, much can be inferred from that, and for me personally, I inferred that, well, they understood that focusing on other titles before getting their main venture, which in this case is Rift, to work properly first probably isn't the best idea. Though it's unsure if it's that, or frankly more damage control, especially as the article states ArcAge had already been in development at the time, and was set to launch later that year. The most beneficial thing population-wise happened to Rift, and that was in November 2013 when Tryon Worlds launched on Steam. Tryon Worlds reported that the move to Steam was a greater boon to population than going free-to-play in the first place, even stating that the new influx of players was greater than both Storm Legion and Rift's free-to-play launch. And Rift's free-to-play model was, well, frankly quite fair at the time. It was getting glowing reviews from fans and media alike, and it was quite obvious that Scott and team were very focused on making sure their business model transition happened as smooth as possible, and didn't upset their current player base. But whether or not that line of ethics and fair practice could be maintained, well, not totally likely considering all of the money involved in Tryon Worlds. And certainly not likely considering both heads of the company came from companies who essentially wrote the book on business handlings in the gaming realm, or at least how to monetize them. By July 2014, Tryon Worlds was reported to have grown to 230 employees with its main Redwood offices and its Austin satellite. And as Scott Hartzman had promised upon returning, Rift didn't seem to be slowing down just yet in regards to its content patches, likely trying to build on the momentum both the free-to-play and Steam launches had given them. On October 22nd, 2014, Rift's second expansion, Nightmare Tide, was released. The expansion brought new zones, a mentoring system, as well as a new warfront. Nightmare Tide also came with Madness Wakes, which is currently under development and includes the Nightmare Cost Dungeon. But Nightmare Tide seemed to be a scaling expansion of sorts. It didn't have the same luster that Storm Legion had, in part due to how the content was updated in a live format of sorts, which means that it essentially was an unfinished expansion. For example, when the expansion launched, it only provided one new raid immediately. They added another shortly after launch of Nightmare Tide, and then well into 2016 were releasing part of the story for Nightmare Tide, and then totaling in about 7 raids. It's right around this time one of the detectives working on the case, so to speak, Holly Roller, postulates that this is where you start to see a drop in the revenue for Tryon, essentially meaning that the peak for Rift was not beyond 2016 at this point. Thanks, Holly Roller, for all the work that you did gathering information on Rift, by the way. As 2016 came to a close, a longtime Rift player and world-first Rift raider, Aurea, created a scathing review video of Rift, detailing his take on what had become of Rift.
I cannot really describe Tryon nicely. Maybe money-grabbing, bullying, childish Nazis?
He talked about how the Rift forum moderators were Nazi-like in their enforcement of rules, and those who spoke against Rift are Tryon Worlds. Aurea also mentioned that the good portion of raids released with Nightmare Tide were either rehashes or not fully tested, as they had rather simple flaws in their design, and that PvP, or open PvP mostly, had essentially ceased to exist and PvP progression was essentially defunct. Aurea in the video would also continue to list other flaws in what Rift had started to become the past few years. For example, how they would release a new set of gear, but not a neck piece, so people essentially would need to buy the previous set of gear, which was offered on the Rift stores. So essentially, they found yet more ways to monetize the game, because they always promised, we'll never make it possible for you to purchase a current set of raid gear, we'll just let you buy previous tiers. But whenever they release new sets of gear, but don't release new sets of armor pieces, like an amulet in this case, come on guys, I think we know what they're trying to do here. Rift devs would actually ban Aurea and then lift the ban after enough stink was made about it all. It wasn't looking good for Tryon to start silencing people. That's usually not a good sign. It seemed from the outside looking in that Tryon had become more and more bold with how they were willing to monetize, and that possibly other aspects of their game were suffering. When Rift launched, free-to-play launched, and then the Steam launch, it always had large enough interest in the game to sustain a moderate-sized population. But Rift never seemed quite able to maintain its population, and I have a few theories on that. One, we can postulate that perhaps Trion's poor customer service and poor forum moderation could lead to a slow burn of customers to accompany the already slow burn that most MMOs suffer from. Other observations I make are, well, Rift initially started as an idea for an MMO that was set to be innovative. Seeing Russell Brown wax poetic about the game's server infrastructure to allow for live content, and these Rift events that, although only a slight innovation on Tabula Rasa's system, it was certainly an innovation. But Rift never quite kept up the innovation, and Rift as an idea in a game never truly evolved past what they were originally constructed to be. What if Rifts could actually tie more into the fabric of the world, where resources, quests, and even group content can be influenced in ways? Or what if it was possible to use the Rifts in a spawning method for each faction, where they can essentially capture a key realm and send enemy Rifts to assault their lands? This is just a few seconds of ideas here, and merely mentioned to illustrate that when you innovate on something, it's not just some single act of innovation. You have to maintain innovation to some extent, maybe even patent it in some cases. Point being, you can't expect to add nothing new or more ambitious to a product, and expect it to match with a game as polished and as feature-rich as World of Warcraft. As we said at the top, if Rift failed to be innovative, it would essentially be a free-to-play version of WoW in many respects, and well, frankly speaking, a very poor-performing one. And one that certainly didn't have the same world building that World of Warcraft had, or just the initial lore period. And by making WoW its apparent competition early on, Rift essentially guaranteed it was always going to be seen as the inferior product in comparison. And what use in really comparing? They had a unique enough mechanic to keep them competitive for a time, but what was to stop WoW from just, I don't know, taking the same idea? Financial troubles for Trion Worlds didn't come apparent until 2017, when speculation surrounding the news was first raised. Scott Hartzman rebuked the rumors speculating that Trion was in financial trouble, but he did say something I found quite interesting. A clue, if you will. It's no secret that there was a pretty big and necessary transition 4 years ago. And when I came back on board in this job, this note was part of Trion investors getting the company some breathing room in 2013. So the company could focus on fixing the business by getting on a path to making more money than it was spending. Strategically, you can think about it as a transition from a more early stage, VC-esque growth at all costs, damn the risk, to sustainable business with growth potential while living within one's means. And well, he actually has a point here. From a business perspective, Rift was stagnating because they were essentially trying to monetize it at some sort of base level, keep it consistent enough, and not spend more money than they earn. But as gradual switch to free-to-play changes, the way you structure your game, and well, likely influence from XL Games with Arcade on how to monetize a game, this first rears its ugly head in December of 2017, where Trion releases a collected Intel microtransaction as a purchasable item, which is an item that allows for the purchase of in-game raid gear. But Trion didn't just stop there. They even had the audacity to do a $100 loot box. Yes, you heard that right. Scott Hartzman stated that they merely attempted to add some fun new events and new sales, and they would remove the $100 loot box with a flimsy apology of sorts. I only say flimsy in this case because, well, when you immediately after it justify it by saying that they need to charge microtransactions because they're a free-to-play game, sorry, that's just a bit insulting. You don't need to treat your audience like idiots or piggy banks and try to sell them a 1 in 42 chance to get a rare mount. Seeing this sort of PR speak from Scott Hartzman, the guy who was supposed to be a positive face for the game, is certainly troublesome. But when doing some research on Scott Hartzman, I made a startling discovery.
You were the chosen one!
That's not to say that everyone who touched SOE is doomed or something, but a producer at Sony Online Entertainment for that long, and you are brought back to Trion to take over as a CEO with a new initiative to essentially monetize and stabilize your product's profits. I don't say any of this to demonize the man, he is but a man doing a job he was hired to do. But I think it's time to stop seeing Scott as a beacon for Rift and start looking at him as a part of Trion Worlds, a company that frankly from the very beginning has always first and foremost been a business. When fans of the game could no longer feel like they could trust the face of their company, it's easy to see why population would continue to dwindle. Well, that was up until Trion Worlds lobbed one last Hail Mary with Rift Prime. Rift Prime was a progression server announced in early 2018, and a desperate attempt at recapturing a large enough audience for the title. The reason I am not very objective about Rift Prime in this case is because the nature of the server itself allows for a scary precedent for developers. Progression servers on one hand appeal to a hardcore raid audience, as it allows them to compete for the top spot again in a sense. and they block off progression past a certain point until they release the new wave of content. On another hand, it can be fun for those who missed the first launch, but on the more sinister side, it's an opportunity for a developer to yet again continue to monetize their audience that is already thirsty for some sort of new content. And instead, what they're getting is essentially rehashed content. In the case of Rift Prime, Tryon would be offering a progression server, but only to those willing to pay a Prime membership. Yep, that means in essence the game on Prime servers was yet again a sub-based game. They were not supposed to offer microtransactions for purchasing, but as you would expect, they did in the form of mounts and bag space. In essence, a progression server, or Rift Prime in this case, is not a vanilla server. Even though you are gated for content and theoretically starting from the beginning, the game itself is still updated to current live updates. So yes, to answer your question that just popped up in your head, that does mean it's literally a live server with a time gate on content. And Rift Prime clearly wasn't balanced enough yet, which is crucial for doing a progression server right. This much is nearly admitted when Tryon has to triple the XP rates after Rift Prime launches in March of 2018. Tryon Worlds only launched with a single Prime server, an NA one, and according to Tryon Brasi, community relations at Tryon World, this was due to the current population not being great, which seems a bit contradictory considering they seem quite happy about their successes in a few reports. Side note, Tryon Brasi also in a Tryon World fashion told EU players who complained about lag on the NA Prime server that, well, he chose to play on EU servers from NA, so others can too. That's the kind of stuff that your community relations manager says. Tryon Worlds reported that thousands of players were subbing to Rift Prime and it was a massive success. Though to be honest at this point, it's probably just PR speak, because it's very unlikely their success is so massive they can't even have enough players to open another server. A bit odd for a rousing success. With Rift Prime, it solved essentially zero of Tryon's issues with Rift. It, however, was a successful business situation or business strategy. Well, at least temporarily. The launch success didn't seem to last too long, however, as typical with most of Tryon's successes. We've had to make the difficult decision to eliminate 15 positions throughout the company. We are extremely grateful for those who have been impacted for their hard work and contributions to Tryon Worlds, and will be offering each of them severance benefits and job placement assistance. This is not related to the performance of the individuals affected, nor of Tryon Worlds as a whole, but was necessary to enable us to develop the upcoming projects that we have planned in the best ways possible. This often can be seen as trimming the fat, so to speak, where you need to keep the company nice and lean to maintain those profit margins. Rift had slowed its production of new content, and that was quite apparent, especially when they essentially started to rely on rehashing of old content, or old raids, or in the case of Rift Prime, just the same raids again. When prompted if Rift was slipping into maintenance mode just 1 month later, they were denying such, stating that they had future content planned for the game. Tryon also made it a point to rebuke any of these staffing rumors concerning their company. When asked if they would be releasing a new expansion, for example a Rift 5.0, they stated coyly, I might add, the team wants to finish the story involving Enket. In the near term, 5.0 is not coming out, they want to finish up the 4.x story first. I interpret that as meaning, well, we won't be getting a 5.0 anytime soon because we're still, quote-unquote, finishing the story, which essentially means we launched an expansion that wasn't really done yet. So content updates, if any, of course, were going to be far and few in between. It didn't seem like you could really trust anything Tryon was reporting at this point, considering they nearly always tried to deny any negative rumors, which is quite expected from a business, but Tryon Worlds looked less and less like an actual video game developer. And well, things reached their ultimate finale when news hit the web in October 2018 that Tryon Worlds would be purchased by European super publisher Gamigo. This would mean that Tryon would have 175 of their 200-person workforce let go. Gamigo is a company with a stable of 30 plus MMOs, 350 plus employees, and offices around the world according to their website. The purchase in particular was an asset buyout, which essentially means that when Gamigo took over the reins, it was because they bought both Tryon and its assets, aka its MMOs in this case, like Rift. But I don't think they can actually take Arcade, but maybe that's a video for another time. Tryon Worlds finally reached the point where they just ran out of rope, and investors wanted their money before things got worse, or just felt that it was the right time to sell the company. Next to nothing was said for over a month after this point, and no new community manager was found for Rift during this time either. And well, this is where our story ends. In November 2018, Rift is now essentially in maintenance mode. With the team letter, Tryon stated that they would be focusing on quality of life changes with their now smaller team. And that's where we can safely say Rift has reached a point of no return. Once an MMO falls into maintenance mode territory, it's essentially guaranteeing it never makes a comeback in its population, because once the current audience starts to lose interest in the game due to next to no new content, well, it's often curtains at that point. But as Gamago does, they will likely continue to milk Rift as much as they possibly can before it eventually is shelved. It's that time of the video where we review some of the clues that could possibly explain why Rift was such a failure ultimately. Although Rift offered unique features in certain respects, it failed to keep up with the curve, and competitors soon took the same formula and improved on it. Because Tryon took so much funding initially, they were in a never-ending race between their revenue and their investors' interests, aka money. Tryon's strong business focus can be seen over time to even increase. When Rift was monetized more and more unfairly, Rift made WoW its competition and ultimately was punching just a few weight classes above where they should be. Tryon had rather poor player management and was far more focused on protecting their image instead of actually helping and supporting their community. At least that's my interpretation of the events. I am merely just one detective after all. I think it's safe to conclude that Rift won't be making a comeback, and that's a shame. I really did like its class system. It's silly that in 2018,
set path. Perhaps, maybe more interestingly, could it be more of a Diablo talent system, where you unlock a number of traits initially, but then as you progress and collect more Azerite power, you unlock different options for those traits that you can swap out. I'm not explaining that very well, but if you don't understand it, just Google Diablo 3 talent unlocks quickly on your phone. You guys all have phones, don't you? And is this going to be just an AP collection thing, or will there be a gear acquisition part to it, like with the Netherlight Crucible? Yeah, that's right, I said Netherlight Crucible. See, Legion wasn't perfect. I think we forget that. That's all yet to be defined. Oh, and by the way, I very much like all of this talk of the Heart of Azeroth actually playing a bigger, more important role in the story too. I very much like this talk. Keep at it with that sweet talk, okay? And yet, right now, no one can say if this is going to be the fix that saves the Azerite system in BFA, or if it turns out to be another interesting idea that doesn't quite work out. But you can feel the collective sigh of relief going around the community that they are at least willing to try something. You get the feeling that the main Azerite change coming in this patch 8.1, the 5th ring, that was probably going to always happen anyway. That was in the pipeline since before this game launched. This, though, represents the real fix, the changes born of a realization that here was a system that wasn't equipped to look after itself once released into the wild. And perhaps these changes are a patch too late. Perhaps it was stubbornness on Blizzard's part that resulted in them being too late. Or perhaps we aren't being understanding enough of how long game development and making these sort of changes actually takes. But whatever, all of that is a separate conversation. The main thing, I guess, is that it's happening in 8.2, which is probably around 5 months away. So yeah, it's big news, it's important news that people will be interested to know about, but it is news for the future, because Azerite armor as we know it is very much here to stay until then. So it's just as well, isn't it, that there is plenty happening in the here and now, with 8.1 finally landing this week. And yeah, I know, in an ideal world, by Ian's own admission, Tides of Vengeance would have arrived about 4 weeks ago. But it's here now, and if I had to sum it up, I'd say it was a patch of surprises. Some of them were good surprises, but some of them, internet, were not so good.
The war campaign, a pleasant surprise. It's not as time-gated as we assumed it would be, with multiple chapters all available to play through straight away, all in one go. Before the patch arrived, we talked about how we expected these storylines to be chopped up and drip-fed to us over the coming weeks, and how that was probably a bad thing. So by rights, we have to put our hands up and give Blizz credit that this isn't really the case. There's a good chunk of story content here for both factions, and there is still more to come leading into the battle for Dazara lore, but getting this much of the campaign in one serving was a kind of, you asked your boyfriend to pick you up some chocolate on his way home and you were expecting like an arrow or something, but he brings back a nice nice Thornton selections instead type surprise. Then there's Darkshore, and yeah, it's a good surprise. Okay, so let's be frank, it's not a I used to hate Warfronts because they're boring and shit, but now Darkshore is here and I love them so much. I'm gonna marry Warfronts, I'm gonna change my middle name to Warfronts, I'm getting a tattoo of Warfronts type surprise. It's still essentially just a Warfront, but I think I'm in the majority when I say it's a lot more streamlined, a lot more direct, feels more like an actual battle than Stromgarde, and is an improvement. And the transmogs are sweet too. It's a Warfront. It's fine. Like, there's a coworker you hate because they're really sarcastic and you come into work one day and he doesn't totally piss you off with the first thing he says type surprise. Oh, and the Darkshore quests leading up to the Warfront? Top-notch. In-game cutscenes with my character hanging out with Tyrande and her weird accent that I'm never I'm not even joking, seriously, what is Tyrande's accent supposed to be? And the new terrifying dark night elf jellybean eyes customization options that come with it. Awesome. Personally, the most unexpected nice surprise so far is invasion assaults. In the whole lead up to Tides of Vengeance, I've been completely uninterested in these. On the face of it, they're nothing we haven't seen before, being BFA's version of the Legion invasion. But some of the events I've taken part in so far have turned out to be so much better, because you know what we didn't have in Legion? War mode. And okay, sorry, if you're one of those people that absolutely refuses to switch war mode on, that's absolutely fine and everything, but we're totally going to talk about how great war mode is right now and how the new invasions facilitate world PvP in a really fun way. Because these assaults only happen in one zone at a time, but the missions are for both factions, and those missions aren't spread all over the map like the ones in Legion either. They are concentrated into a very specific area, which means all those Alliance and Horde players get funneled into more or less the same place, and all around them are NPCs dressed in their faction colors, going at each other, and you know it would be rude not to join in, so you join in, and before you know it, there's some excellent world PvP going on, and it's not even random. It totally feels like there should be PvP going on in this place at this time. It doesn't happen every time there's an assault up, but when it does, it's awesome, and totally what the big Battle for Azeroth faction war should be feeling like on the day-to-day. A kind of a, I went to the dentist to get a root canal, but when I got there, the dentist drill was broken, so we just went and watched Into the Spider-Verse instead type surprise. And then there's the frame rate. Now look, I don't know if that new DirectX 12 multi-threading thing that we've heard about has been implemented or not yet, but I can't be the only one that's noticed substantial FPS gains since 8.1, especially in places where it's usually pretty bad, like Borealis. In fact, I know I'm not. Most people with DirectX 12 compatibility have 20 extra frames per second in their BFA capital, which is a big deal if you were only managing around 40 in the first place. A kind of a, someone sent me loads of gold in an in-game mail, and I don't know if they did it on purpose or not, but I'm keeping it anyway kind of surprise. And the leveling XP-ner, it's actually really noticeable how much quicker it is to level up now. Happy days. And the surprise edition of the Elixir of Tongues, which allows you to understand what people on the other faction are saying, is great, even though it's not quite as fun as the name suggests it to be. But it's not all blowjobs and strawberries and Tides of Vengeance, of course. This week has had its fair share of less than pleasant surprises too, in the form of the good old undocumented changes. There's a ton of these with every major patch. Wowhead has a great article which we'll link below covering them all, from dungeon mob changes to the missing portals in the Pandaria capitals to minuscule alterations of boss health and decades-old content. But there always just seems to be one or two that you feel really would have probably been worth mentioning at some point in advance, you know? Like when players discovered pretty early on that they could no longer delete Mythic Plus keys. Yeah, that's a big one, I guess. Ian explained this in the Q&A at the end of the week, saying that you aren't supposed to be able to delete keys and get replacements, you couldn't in Legion after all, and that this was something they'd had to implement to try and clean up the mess after people were getting totally the wrong keys in the first week of BFA, which is fine as a reason, but you've kind of got to ask, did we need to leave the key deleting thing in the game for 3 months after it had fixed Blizzard's initial mess? You've got to expect players are going to be used to it by then, right? And okay, so this was actually in the patch notes but it still was a nasty surprise for most people. As was the artifact knowledge freeze. Every week the amount of artifact power you need for each new level on your Heart of Azeroth has decreased, making it easier for new characters to catch up. A much better implemented version of the Legion system which did exactly the same thing. You may not have noticed it happening, but without it you'd have a considerably lower level on your neck piece right now. With 8.1, that steady decrease in required artifact power has been temporarily halted, meaning for the first time since BFA launched, it's no easier for you to reach your next level next week than it is this week. This is what happened in Legion at various points too, and the reason is obvious, as Ian said in the Q&A later. If you didn't put artifact knowledge on hold every now and then, you'd start to see massive gaps between players. And that's the thing, even though it's a nasty surprise, it's actually the right decision from a gameplay point of view, and pretty much everyone agrees with that. The kind of thing where if it had been announced to us in advance, would have been a good thing, rather than something people make angry Twitter posts and YouTube videos about. And surely right? I don't think they purposely tried to keep this a secret or anything malicious, because if it was, then Blizzard have taken the worst at keeping secret title from Rachel Dolezal. There's no way that they were hoping we wouldn't notice this. I genuinely think it's probably just what they say it was, them being a bit rubbish. Like they were rubbish with communicating the Keystone change. And it's not great, obviously, but the most important thing has to be that the correct decision has been made overall with artifact knowledge. Like, I'd rather have the right system implemented with terrible communication than the wrong system implemented with excellent communication in the long run. Obviously, it would be great, Blizz, if we could get both sometimes, you know? But I'm married to Taliesin, I'm used to compromise.
But really, it's easy to see why a player base, which was kind of on edge anyway, would have got upset about these things. So let me ask you something, Internet. When you've just released a new major patch a little bit later than you'd like, and you drop the ball on a couple of things it would have been really easy just to not drop the ball on, like something as simple as announcing something in advance, and that is distracting an agitated community from some of the genuinely good stuff in your patch, what would be the best way, do you think, of getting things back on track? I know what I would do. Playable Tuskars, obviously. But we all know that the WoW devs are proper jealous of my amazing ideas, or, you know, my one amazing Tuskar-shaped idea, and that'll never happen. So instead, we got a new store mount! The Vulpine Familiar is clearly awesome and beautiful, and it's got wings, which is stupid because everyone knows that a flying fox mount should have spinning propeller tails for flying. That's just science. You can't argue with science. But whatever, this is a unique and desirable mount, and it is yours for only $25 or £19 or whatever you pay for your store mounts wherever you are. And you know, Internet, there are those that might argue that with everything I've just said about the player base being on edge right now, that actually this might not be the best time to release a store mount. What with all the stigma of corporate greed and microtransactions, and that this is definitely terrible optics, but surprisingly perhaps, that's not so much on forums, where actually it was generally agreed now was the perfect time to release a new store mount. 8.1 has brought so many new mounts to the table with such a variety of different ways to acquire them that actually any resentment about a new cash shop addition to the stable generally got diluted by the general happiness of mount collectors over the plethora of no, it was a shit show. Obviously. It just keeps happening! I'm gonna be honest, this is pretty disgusting. It's the reason I changed my battle tag to Blizzard sucks. Why are we okay with Blizzard putting any mounts in the shop and no way to earn them in the game? The fact that you can't get them in-game without spending extra cash is the problem for me and others. Cool mounts available in-game would be so much better. Now, I know what you're thinking, Internet. You're thinking, oh, those last 3 comments are actually really reasonable, to be fair, and you're right. They are. And the thing is, I totally agree that when you have a game with a subscription, everything should be earnable in the game. Every little bit of content that those devs make should be attainable to me. It doesn't have to be easy, but I have to still have access to it. I hate cash shops in games. I hate microtransactions. In fact, that second comment, this is pretty disgusting, that's my comment on the announcement of the Mythic Rune Saber back in WoD, and I hope you appreciate the excellent point I'm making here, because this comment took me hours, seriously, to find for this. But that was me. I used to rage against the cash shop every day. There is no way there should be things on that shop that you cannot earn in game. But here's the thing, it's not like that anymore. Because since the WoW token came along, everything on that cash shop is earnable in-game with in-game gold, without you paying a penny of extra cash on top of your subscription, which, by the way, you can also buy in-game with gold and not have to pay real money for at all. So comments like, cool mounts available in-game would be so much better, are not funny. They actually worry me, because they're just wrong. And they make me worry that there are so many comments like this. I feel like so many people don't actually understand that this new mount, like everything else on the store, is available without spending any real money. Pretty easily too, to be honest. And furthermore, if you're a long-time viewer of this channel, you'll know this because we explain how to do it on the first ever episode of the Weekly Reset.
Hello Internet, my name is Taliesin.
And I'm Evita.
And welcome to the Weekly Reset.
Yeah, that one. And you know, it's pretty complicated, pretty long-winded, so I was tempted just to replay the segment from that video, but I decided to put the work in instead, and so here is our updated guide for 2018. Buy a WoW token from the auction house using your in-game gold, and when you click on it, just select Add to Battle.net balance instead of game time, and there it is! Free IRL money in your Battle.net account. Like, seriously, for reals. It's going to take you 2 WoW tokens to buy this new store mount, which is about 350,000 gold, more than 10 times cheaper than the Brutosaur, cheaper than the Spider, cheaper than the Lightforged Warframe, and about the same price as the beautiful new Frog Boy mounts, which is unfortunate for the Fox really, because seriously, why would anyone ever buy that when you could get this beautiful round jumpy boy for the same amount of gold? You know, it turns out I think I've got a thing for perfectly round mounts. Like seriously, the rounder the better apparently. Now you probably know this already because you know you watched the first ever episode of the Weekly Reset back in February 2017.
And this is our new weekly show. It's going to come out every week on the dot like clockwork.
Yeah, that one. But clearly a huge amount of players don't, and this is why I don't rage against store mounts anymore. I don't like the store. I don't disagree with arguments that obviously it might be more fun to have these mounts behind a quest line or something, but those are all details. The only argument I can make for them being bad or wrong is if I can't get them in game, and I can. Considerably easier than I can most other gold-only mounts as it happens. So this is not a defense of the store or cash mounts. I will happily agree with every criticism you have of them, except if you say the fact that you can't get them in game without spending extra cash is the problem for me and others, because that's just not true. Criticism is useless if you get your facts wrong. And you know, please don't even think of this as me disagreeing with you, but as a public service announcement. And yeah, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but yeah, Taliesin, someone had to pay you that money. Somewhere along the line for that WoW token you bought with gold, money has still changed hands here. Yeah, like I'm supposed to care about that when I get free shit because I play the game a lot. In fact, that makes me like it more. Now think about this, hardcore gamer bros. Who is most likely to buy a WoW token for money? What you would call a casual gamer. Who then gets free stuff because they did that? You, the hardcore gamer who puts more hours into the game. This is better than free shit, bro. This is casuals paying for your shit. Don't tell me you don't like that idea, bro. I know you like that idea. It's like POG or something. It's probably POG. Oh, we made it.
Yeah.
Another episode, another weekly reset, one that may not have happened and very nearly did. Now, my apologies if you're like a regular viewer of this channel and you were really looking forward to the midweek video this week.
Yeah.
Because you will have noticed if you were looking out for it, it didn't happen though. And this one's probably very late. We're a little bit behind there because everything's taking a lot longer. And the reason for that is this. Do you remember last week when we were sitting on this very sofa? Right here, you were there.
I remember.
I was here.
And then we were talking.
You said something witty and clever. Went to edit it on the big computer, and the big computer wouldn't turn on because the water pump on our had gone. So I spent Monday and Tuesday replacing the water cooling pump on the computer, which I turned out to be what I thought really, really good at.
It was pretty amazing.
I actually created a really beautiful new loop with a little tap in it, so easier to drain next time and stuff like that.
All of the draining and the cutting and the delicate maneuvering.
It was very delicate. It was really good, especially when I accidentally cut my hand really, really badly on like a sharp bit of barb that was being used with the tubing, and like quite badly. And what happened was I kind of accidentally bled all over the graphics card, which you will have seen on stream because it was fine for a couple of hours, but then obviously the actual Taliesin's actual blood from my actual body must have shorted the card, and it shorted and died live on stream.
Yeah.
Like we were doing a stream, I was riding my hippo, and the graphics card went. Maybe the graphics card needed more blood. Maybe it got a taste for it.
Yeah.
Maybe it was like, maybe that's why it was running so well before. It was like, oh, this is amazing. I need more. And when it got none, it was like, oh, withering. I didn't hear over the cool sounds of my cool stream.
R.I.P. graphics card.
Yeah, so the graphics card completely went, and obviously then Wednesday and Thursday were spent working out actually kind of what had happened and what had gone.
Hello Internet, Taliesin here, and today we are talking something a little bit different, because it's that time of year, isn't it, where we give gifts to our loved ones and get cozy with some mulled wine, and that's exactly what I'm gonna do right now. I've got my best Christmas haircut on, the office tree is up, and I've got an awesome present for my most loved one of all, me. Because this video, Internet, is my present to myself this year. The video that I promised I'd allow myself to make if I was a really good boy who worked really hard. And okay, so I didn't really work all that hard, but that's details, so screw it. Here is my video about the Tinker class in World of Warcraft. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh great, a video of wild speculation where Taliesin fantasizes all over my face about what a Tinker class would be like, as if no one's ever done that before. But you're wrong, Internet. Because this video here is a little bit more than pure wishful thinking. In fact, I am here to tell you that the Tinker class has gone beyond the realms of speculation and onto the very boundaries of existence. Internet, prepare to be amazed, because for the next 10 minutes or so, I am going to present to you a watertight case and show you not only is Tinker 100% guaranteed to be the next playable class in WoW, not only will it be arriving next expansion, but that the Warcraft devs have already spent pretty much the whole of BFA getting us subtly used to the idea, laying the groundwork for the races that will be able to play it, and testing out ways to make it work when it gets here. So join us for this special holiday Taliesin Talks as we look at Tinkers, the next playable class in World of Warcraft, and how they are already in the game. Okay? Go! So first, an explanation. What even is a Tinker, and why does everyone keep talking about? Well, Tinkers have actually been a part of the Warcraft universe since Warcraft 3 with the Goblin Tinker Hero unit, a goblin mechanic and inventor kitted out in a homemade mech suit. And you know, there may have been just the tiniest little bit of influence from the Gretchen mech boys of Warhammer 40k. The idea being that here was a fighter who relied more on their ingenuity and technology to do the dirty work rather than any physical strength, combat or magical ability. And it's a concept that has cropped up in Warcraft regularly over the years, both in the now non-canon, but we still bring it up whenever it supports whatever lore argument we're trying to make, Warcraft RPG, and in game too, especially in the gnome and goblin races, High Tinker Mechatalk and, you know, the Venture Company being some pretty obvious examples. And the engineering profession has long been a way for players in WoW to indulge in their zany contraption and gizmo fetishes, like a steampunk and slightly rubbish James Bond, but there has always been talk of something more, of a playable class that would allow us to approach this fantasy as the be-all and the end-all, as our actual playable identity throughout the game. A class who, when they join their guildies in raid, instead of helping to bring down bosses with a sword or a spell, have a range of abilities somehow based around turrets, bots, or maybe even a mech suit of their very own. So that's what we mean when we say Tinker in a WoW context, and that's what I mean when I talk about it in this video. And we'll take some time to look at how Blizz are hinting that might actually work in game a little bit later on. But with the definition of Tinker established, there's a more important question. Why am I so sure that Tinkers will be the next playable class? And why am I so convinced that they will be arriving in 9.0? And why Tinker instead of one of those other classes that everyone always talks about when they talk about these sort of things, like Necromancer or Bard? Well, it's my belief that Tinker no longer deserves to be in the same category as those other classes, because they're really fun ideas that are interesting to speculate about. But over the course of Battle for Azeroth, though, I think there is genuine, compelling, and unignorable evidence that suggests that the playable Tinker class is a real-life idea that Blizzard are playing with and trying to make work. So let's start with the vaguest stuff and work our way in. Next expansion, whatever that expansion and its themes may be, is when you would expect a new playable class to be introduced on the World of Warcraft expansion timeline, because throughout the game's history, Blizzard have kept to a pretty strict policy of a new class every other expansion. Vanilla gave us, well, you know, all of the classes. It was the start of the game. Burning Crusade made Shaman and Paladin cross-faction, but didn't give us a new class. Wrath, though, introduced Death Knights. Cataclysm was barren on the class front before Mists of Pandaria served up monks. WoD didn't really have much of anything really, and then Legion ushered in the age of the Demon Hunter, and with there being no new classes in Battle for Azeroth, that means we are absolutely in line for a new playable option next time out. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yeah, well, Taliesin, simply introducing a new class into the game is a lot more complicated now than ever before, because the older WoW gets and the more classes that get added, the bigger the job Blizzard give themselves every expansion when it comes to balance. Thinking of new abilities, abilities and talents, even new animations that we've been seeing a lot of recently. It's probably the sheer amount of classes that devs are juggling right now that we have to blame for the lack of my lovely precious tier sets in BFA, and that's an actual tragedy. And do the devs really need the extra worry of another new addition to that roster? And you know what, Internet, that's a very good point. It would be easy to say no. Obviously not. More so than a new playable race, classes aren't just a massive amount of work to add to an expansion, they are a commitment to a whole ton of extra work every expansion. And yeah, actually, I bet the last thing anyone working on WoW right now wants is to give themselves that ball ache. And yet, those expansions that do feature new classes, Vanilla, Wrath, Mists, Legion, what do those expansions all have in common? I think you know. They are the best ones. The ones that everyone loves. Cataclysm and Warlords of Draenor in particular come in for stick, and it seems like BFA might be destined to be heading that way too. So if Blizzard want to pull off another Legion-style Rescue Act next expansion, they could do worse than giving us a new class to play. And the next thing you're thinking too, you're thinking, but Taliesin, all those other new classes, Death Knights, Monks, and Demon Hunters, have tied in pretty seamlessly with the themes of those expansions. If we really are in line for a Tinker class, what's that supposed to tell us about 9.0? That it's going to be set on a junkyard? It doesn't make any sense. And actually, you're totally right about that. That is a very good point, especially if, as widely expected by everyone at this point, next expansion turns out to be an old god Black Empire tentacle fest. It's admittedly pretty hard to see where a steampunk Tinker class really fits in there. So yeah, I totally agree with that point, but to me, it actually makes me even more sure of my prediction. Because as I will now, I want to say argue, but argue is kind of the wrong word. As I will now point out, I think Blizzard is aware that their new class for next expansion doesn't fit the theme of the expansion like it has done in the past, which is why, for the first time, they've gone out of their way to lay the groundwork for a new class, the expansion before. And I'm now going to highlight the many clues that we've already been given, as well as some that are yet to come, that all point towards Tinker being a done deal. So it didn't take Benedict Cumberbatch doing a weird City Down My Museum investigation to work out where previous new classes slotted in with the themes of the expansion that they were introduced in. Thank goodness, because yo, Benny Cum, I love you and everything, but honestly, that My Museum thing, let's never do that again, okay? Death Knights were literal champions of the Lich King. Monks were an embodiment of the completely newly discovered culture of the Pandaren. Demon Hunters were sexy flesh-bearing tattooed emo lords who were the obvious weapon to enlist against a bunch of sexy flesh-bearing demon emo lords. It makes sense. A Tinker engineering robots and ad hoc technology to use against a newly reborn old god Black Empire isn't quite such an obvious fit. But if there's one thing that Blizzard has absolutely loved sneaking into WoW in the last few years, it's foreshadowing. We saw it in Legion, where in a random cave in Azuna you could find shipwrecked Zandalari and Kultiran soldiers, paving the way for the locations of the coming battle for Azeroth. And I believe that Blizzard have been doing the same thing in BFA, on a much grander scale, dropping subtle and not so subtle clues to get us, the player base, all used to the idea of Tinkers before 9.0, so that it doesn't feel out of place when they do. In short, if the story of the next expansion isn't going to lend itself to the new Tinker class, the next best thing is to have the story of this expansion explain and facilitate it. The first time I got a little tingle of an idea that there might be something going on in BFA was the abandoned junk heap area in Tiragard Sound, because it's this incredibly random, incredibly distinctive, and essentially meaningless corner of the map, absolutely chock full of unique art assets. And without wanting to appear too cynical in my old age, I took one look at that and I thought, you know, there is no way that they have created this many new assets just for the 2 or 3 quests that happen to be here. We are 100% going to be seeing a lot more of this sort of stuff, and as we will see in just a little bit, that proved to be bang on the money, because we will be. And then there's island expeditions, or more accurately, your opponents in island expeditions. Because if you are one of the 99.9% of players that doesn't partake in the PvP version of BFA's second least popular gameplay mode, then you will be very familiar by now with the opposing computer-controlled teams from the other faction that you come up against. Their actions dictated by the incredible, game-changing new Blizzard AI, which makes them, you know, jump up and down a lot. It's uncanny, really. It could easily be an actual real-life player that you're up against here with all that jumping up and down and stuff. Now, obviously, the best opposition team in the entire game is the Tauren Warbraves, because honestly, they are just so polite. Spirit Walker Kura is like, oh, please get back on your boat and go. That'll just be easier for everyone. And you can see that all of the Warbraves represent real in-game classes. A Shaman, Druid, and a Paladin. They are all supposed to be able to pass for real-life players with their amazing AI, after all, right? And you see this in all of the other teams too. Recognizable classes, except for a couple. Because on the Horde side is Gazlo's Grease Monkeys, and hanging out in Borealis, you'll find Razak's Roughneck Raiders. And the thing is, they are unique among the Island Expedition crews in that they aren't recognizable in-game classes at all. They are something completely different. Because here, in the game, right now, alongside NPCs representing other classes that players can choose for their characters, are what we would recognize as Tinkers. And if that wasn't intriguing enough, the Grease Monkeys and the Roughneck Raiders aren't just a random collection of engineering style abilities thrown together without any thought. Each team has a recognizable tank, DPS, and healer class within its ranks. We haven't just got a glimpse of a new class here, we've got the specs too. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, Taliesin, this is quite fun, but it's hardly cast iron proof that there will be a playable Tinker class next expansion. And you're right, it's not. If you were laying out the groundwork for a new class, an expansion in advance, putting a team each of Goblin and Gnome Tinkers into a game as expedition opponents, where the AI is supposed to make you think of them as actual players, would be a pretty good start, wouldn't it? Another good thing to do, I'd imagine, would probably be to have a selection of Tinker lore characters suddenly become very important and noticeable to players, like maybe Kelsey Steelspark hopping into a mech to help out Alliance players in the Vol'dun Assault in 8.1, or if you're Horde, the full-on mech battles that happen between Gallidwix and Mechatalk in the new War Campaign storylines. Maybe you'd even put in dialogue that mentions in passing how the Gnome High Tinker probably wishes he was part machine. And of course, it doesn't stop there, because in 8.2, Rise of Ashara, we will actually travel to the lost zone of Mechagon, which uses all those spiffy new Junk-Keep assets we mentioned earlier, and become proper besties with the Mecha Gnomes, who, oh shit, would you believe it, what a coincidence, are gnomes augmented with machinery. Just the type of race you would introduce as an allied race if you needed more options for a Tinker class. And this is the biggest clue of all for me, because one of the big drawbacks for this class was the amount of races that could actually play it. Because, you know, you've got gnomes and dwarves and goblins, and that's really about it. But another thing that's been happening in BFA is the introduction of more and more playable races that would be a good fit for an upcoming Tinker class, like Dark Iron Dwarves, or the fact that there's a cheeky Forsaken character in the Grease Monkeys, or the fact that the two most popular bets for the next allied races are Vulpera for the Horde and Mechagnomes for the Alliance, two races that would just so happen to be perfect candidates for playable Tinkers. And that may not seem like much to you, but that's already 3 times as many different races that Demon Hunters have to choose from. It's all just too much of a coincidence for me, which is why at this stage I am absolutely certain that this class is coming in 9.0. There's just so much in BFA that seems to be laying foundations for it and getting players used to the idea. And so, with all that in mind, how would this new class actually work? Usually when you're spitballing ideas about how a made-up class that you've just made up might work in the game, you're basically just making shit up because it's pure speculation, and that is absolutely okay because speculation is fun, but that's not actually something that we have to do too much of in this case. We can instead just look at those Tinkers that already exist in BFA and see what they do. Like we said before, the Grease Monkeys and the Roughneck Raiders already appear to exist in 3 pretty distinct classes, so it's easy to see how a Tinker healing class would utilize bots to proactively heal their teammates and decoys to draw attacks away from them. They could also do like an Overwatch Ana style shooting syringes of awesome revitalizing if slightly suspicious looking liquids into their allies. And this raises a great thing about Tinkers in general. At last, we could have another class who could equip firearms. Further to that, interestingly, in Warcraft 3, Tinker was the only melee class that used intelligence as a primary attribute, and that could be really fun in WoW too. A tank that needs intelligence gear, a healer looking for intelligence on their guns. Yeah, this is fun, sign me up. For a DPS spec, yeah, it's true that the gnomes and goblins in BFA use walking bomb things, just like in Warcraft 3, as well as turrets, which in itself I think is quite an interesting mechanic. Could WoW support an actual turret DPS class where you run around like Torbjorn placing and maintaining turrets that are liable to all get wiped out every time there's raid-wide damage, I would be up for giving that a try. But alternatively, you could go full Kelsey Steelspark and jump into a fully automated mini-mech. And this leads us to probably the most exciting prospect of a Tinker class, the mech suit. Because yeah, as you'd expect, both the Grease Monkeys and Roughneck Raiders have recognizable tanks that use proper, fully fledged mech suits to get down and dirty with, and this would seem like a great way to have a playable tank Tinker spec, which just makes you think, doesn't it? The lore of 8.1 is so determined to push the idea of characters legit using mech suits as a totally viable Warcraft combat option, so why couldn't your mech suit be a genuine part of your Tinker character customization? Now, this wouldn't be new. Death Knights and Demon Hunters are both classes that have their own unique character customization options. What if, when you started your Tinker class, you didn't just pick the visual features of your character, but of your mech suit as well? In the same way that druids can shift seamlessly in and out of bear form to tank, so your gnome or mecha gnome or dwarf or dark iron or goblin or forsaken or Vulpera could summon and hop in and out of their very own personal mech. I mean, come on, you don't need me to tell you, this would be so amazingly cool, and again, not something that doesn't even already exist in the game. Druids, Shadow Priests, and Worgen all have different forms that they take for combat. This is just that, but with an added layer of customization. And if you're going to go to all that trouble, it would be a shame to make it just a tank thing. The mech suit saddle up could be something all Tinker specs could do. And there, straight away, you have a totally unique class here, but one that is based 100% on things that are in the game and that Blizzard have been going out of their way to highlight in this expansion, with the chance to utilize some really fun mechanics and abilities that still aren't alien to the combat systems already in the game, and which offer a huge new range of cool visual customization options, which is something we know Blizzard are totally in love with right now. Because, you know, they know that introducing cool new options like that is a great and relatively easy way to keep players engaged, and a class with its own mech suit options, that would be an absolute goldmine for them and for us, the player. Maybe when you take any of these things I've talked about here in isolation, they seem like just a little bit too much of a coincidence, but I think when you take them as a whole and see the way that Blizzard is right now putting Tinkers right in front of us in Battle for Azeroth, I am totally convinced that it's because we are getting this new class next expansion. Tinkers with customizable mechs taking on the old gods in the new Black Empire. Yes. Yes, please. All types of big, glorious, wonderful yes. That'll do nicely. But what do you guys think? Do you agree that it's looking pretty likely for the Tinker next expansion, or am I just talking out of my exhaust? How would the spec work? How would you play it? And probably most important of all, you know, how could we possibly make it the mail-wearing new class that we so desperately need? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for joining us today.
WoW actually has a lot of secret bosses, and for this list, Secret Boss will be a boss that is either hidden in an out-of-the-way location, or requires a special series of events to summon. And with this video, I'll be talking about bosses that fit a little bit of both of those categories. At number 10, we have the Lurker Below. Now this boss in the Serpent Shrine Caverns, despite being well known today, was actually a secret boss. The only way to access this boss was to fish in this random pool in the water. So one day, someone randomly decided to fish in this pool in the middle of nowhere, inside the raid, all of a sudden they now had a secret boss. And it wasn't too long before everyone else found out about it. But there's one thing they didn't know about the boss, was that if you killed the boss Hydros and cleared all the mobs on the platforms, it would steam the pools, killing all the fishes inside of it, making the phase where Lurker Below spins around with his jet stream thing super easy to do. Especially since Lurker Below was kind of buggy, as when he did the slow turn of his water gun, he would sometimes just spin around his little spot uncontrollably, knocking everyone off into the pool, who would then get killed by the fishes in the water. And since Blizzard was really slow to fix bugs back in the day, the best way to do this fight was to kill him after you'd steam the water. That way you wouldn't have to worry about the jet stream bug and could just jump into the water during his water gun phase, because the scalding water did a lot less damage than the fishes did. At number 9, we have Nightbane, both of them. Nightbane was a secret boss in the original Karazhan that you had to complete a little quest chain before you could even summon him. Then in Legion, when they re-added Karazhan to the game as a mega dungeon, they added a way to fight Nightbane again, where you had to go around and kill a couple of the bosses within a certain amount of time, and then click crystals behind them. And if you were quick enough on clicking all of the crystals, Nightbane would spawn. And then when you killed Nightbane, he would drop 1 mount for 1 player. So if you had a group of 5 people, you just went in there 5 different times if you wanted everyone to get the mount. Now, Legion Nightbane wasn't really a secret boss, as many people knew about him, but the Burning Crusade version absolutely meets the criteria. Number 8, Engineer Omega Plug. This secret boss was added in Legion and Nomergon. In order to access Omega Plug, you have to click on a hidden button on the back of a pillar in the same room as the final boss of Nomergon, Thermal Plug. There are a lot of red buttons in the room, but only one tiny button behind a pillar. Once pushed, the secret boss will spawn, who has max level stats. Despite the boss being in a low level dungeon, Omega Plug is max level, and will wipe any low level group that tries to fight him normally. Same with max level characters too, as once you engage him, he spawns a whole bunch of bombs that basically one-shot you without defensive cooldowns, and there's too many of them to avoid. So what you have to do is click the other red buttons in the room in order to stop the bombs from spawning. If you're smart, you can pull the boss out of the room to reset, and then go in and click the buttons before he respawns, and while the buttons are still active. But if you're like me, you can also just run in and press 1 at a time and die, and just press the next one on your next attempt, until you eventually get all 6 of them. This boss isn't exactly soloable, and I don't have any friends, so I wasn't able to get a kill. But if you do have friends to bring along and manage to kill it, it does drop a toy item called the Vial of Green Goo for all of your efforts. And at number 7, we have High Inquisitor Fairbanks. Fairbanks was a secret boss in the Scarlet Monastery, hidden away in a secret room where you had to click on a little lever in order to open the secret door. Now, this boss fits the description of a secret boss to a T. It's not needed to complete the dungeon, he's hidden away in a hidden room, and the way to get into the room is to flip a hidden switch. This boss was removed with Mist of Pandaria, however, so when you enter the room nowadays, all you see is a dead body on the floor. I should probably also mention here, this list will include secret bosses which are no longer in the game. Number 6, Anzu. Anzu back in the Burning Crusade was a secret boss in the Sethic Halls, who could only be summoned by druids who had completed the last stage of their druid epic flight form quest, a quest chain which required 15 previous quests, with defeating Anzu being the second to last quest of that chain. And after you completed the quest chain, you'd be given a key that allowed you to summon Anzu whenever you did the place. Now, despite being a secret boss only summonable by one class who had to complete a very long quest chain, Anzu was actually a very well-known secret boss, because he had a chance to drop a mount. And nothing motivates players in WoW more than the chance of obtaining a rare mount model, as Anzu's mount was one of a kind. Nowadays, Anzu is up by default all the time, so you can go in there and farm the mount without needing a druid in your party, and it's no longer a secret boss. But it used to be, and it used to be a very popular secret boss. Number 5, Ironaya. This is another one that used to be a secret boss, but nowadays you just fight her like normal whenever you want. In order to unlock her secret door to allow you to actually fight the boss, you had to combine 2 items you found separately inside the dungeon of Oldemon. One item was located in a chest in a room off to the side, and the other item just dropped from one of the first bosses in the dungeon. Then, once you had the 2 items, you just combined them together. Then you went to the miniature town in the middle of this room, and you placed the item called the Staff of Prehistoria into a little mechanism which would then start a little event that would shoot a laser beam at the door and open it, where Ironaya would bust out and you'd be able to fight her. Of course, nowadays, the Staff of Prehistoria is already in the little mechanism, so all you have to do is just click on it to fight her, instead of having to combine it and do it yourself. Number 4, Uruk Doomhowl. This boss, located in the lower Blackrock Spire, does show up on the boss list when you enter the dungeon nowadays, but it's listed as a bonus objective. This is how Blizzard keeps some of the secret bosses in the game, but just updated for the modern dungeon interface. Luckily, the way to summon Urok is still the same as it was back in vanilla. All you have to do is kill the first boss in the instance, High Lord Omok, and loot his head. Then, as you run the dungeon, you'll notice various spears and spikes along the walls, and most of them are clickable. So all you have to do is just click on one of them to get it. Then you have to go to this location with a whole bunch of skulls on the floor, and then use the spear and the head from your inventory on the pile of skulls, which will start a little event. Once you kill all the ogres that come out for the event, Urok will come in after. It's nice Blizzard left this little hidden boss in the game with the same summoning mechanics after how many of the other secret bosses were removed. Number 3, Gazranka. This was a secret boss in old school Zul'Gurub that you could only fight through fishing, similar to the Lurker below. But unlike the Lurker below, you had to do a little bit more than just fish. What you had to do was go into the raid and find the abandoned camp, and click on this box which would give you a quest. The quest would then send you to Dustwallow Marsh to find Nat Pagle. After completing the quest, you could then buy an item from Nat Pagle, but in order to use the item, you had to fish up 5 specific fish that only spawned inside the dungeon. So you had to go back to Zul'Gurub, fish up 5 mud skunk fishes, then go back to the abandoned camp and combine the item you bought from Nat Pagle with the 5 fishes, and then fish from the camp. And then you'd be able to summon the Hydra. The Hydra dropped a whole bunch of fishing themed items, as well as the Tome of Polymorph Turtle. And since the Tome of Polymorph Turtle could be sold, some people would just farm the boss in order to sell them on the auction house. Also, probably not related, but there's a secret rare in Zuldazar that's located under a bridge behind a waterfall that's a green Hydra named Gazralka. Considering most of the Hydras have Gaz in their name, it's most likely not directly related, but it is a green Hydra and its name is very similar, so maybe it could be an homage to Gazranka. Number 2, Atal Alarion. I really hope I'm pronouncing all these names correctly. This troll boss, located in the Sunken Temple, is a really good example of how a secret boss should be summoned. In order to bring this boss out, you have to go into one of the side rooms in the old Sunken Temple when it was still gigantic, and click the snake statues surrounding the room in a particular order. The order for the statues will be shown on screen, and if you click the statues in the right order, then the boss would spawn in the middle of the room. And then you and your group could just jump down and fight it for some extra loot. This secret boss was also required for 2 class quests, one for druids and another for horde paladins, which, funny enough, they added in the Burning Crusade, despite this being a vanilla boss. The class quests weren't anything important, just one of the many class quests they used to offer back then. But while looking into this boss, I couldn't really see how people would have ever found out the correct order of the statues. I assume there's a way people found out how to click them in the right order in game, but I also think they probably just clicked on them randomly until someone found it out and then just posted it online. With the revamp of a lot of the old dungeons in Cataclysm, they removed a lot of the extra rooms in the Sunken Temple, and with them removed, also the room in which this boss spawned, so it's no longer in the game. And number 1, Yor, the Void Hound of Shafar. This is a secret boss in the Mana Tombs, only available after completing a 10-part quest chain that involves a rep grind. To start the quest chain, you have to get honored with a consortium, which can be accomplished pretty easily with a few quests or farming Mana Tombs. Then you have to complete the quest Seek Out a Mirror in the Netherstorm. Then after you complete that quest, you'll have to do 3 more quests in Netherstorm that involve getting Ethereum prison keys and freeing prisoners, and getting revered with the consortium, which will require another rep grind. Once those quests are complete, you'll be sent to Blade Edge Mountain and free another prisoner, who you must kill for an item you turn into the image of Commander Amir. He will then ask you for 5 Ethereum prison keys in order to trade to him for 1 Ethereum stasis chamber key, which you will then use to randomly open one of the prisons around Blade Edge Mountain to kill a prisoner for their ID card. But this is not a guaranteed drop. So you must go out and farm 5 more Ethereum prison keys to turn in for the Ethereum stasis chamber key every time you want to attempt this quest. And prison keys do not have a high drop chance. And there were not very many on the auction house to buy when I was doing this quest chain for footage for this video. Once you finally get lucky and get the mark of the Nexus King from one of the prisoners, you'll then get sent on a quest to go to the Mana Tombs to free an NPC from prison. Then you must go back to Blade Edge Mountain to terminate the quest. The next part of the quest chain requires you to be exalted with the Consortium. And since you can only clear out heroic Mana Tombs once per day, you can't just farm for the rep easily. So you have to get rep the old-fashioned way, and that's by questing. Or endlessly killing ads on the final boss in the Mana Tombs, who spawns one once every 20 seconds for 20 rep each. Luckily, once you hit Exalted, all you have to do is talk to the quest giver in the Blade Edge Mountain, and that's it. He'll give you the key to Yor's prison. Then, in order to summon the boss, all you have to do is go back to the Mana Tombs, clear up to the last boss, and Yor is located in the prison right next to the final boss. And as long as you have the key, you can summon it. Now, the reason this one is number 1 is basically because it's the most time-consuming secret boss to spawn out of all the other ones on this list that's also still in the game. Funny enough, if you do manage to do the quest to spawn him, you can actually spawn him during Burning Crusade time walking weeks to get a little bit of extra time walking currency when doing the dungeon on its time walking version. Alright, and that's it for the video. There's actually quite a lot of secret bosses in WoW, so I didn't include all of them. If you think there's a secret boss that I should have included on this list instead of some of the ones I chose, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.
What's up everybody, welcome back to my laboratory where safety is #1 priority, and for today I put up a little compilation of my favorite seen on TV gadgets that I have put to the test throughout the years on my second channel. So most of you have not seen it because on this channel we almost have 11 million subscribers, on the second channel it's only 3. So this is a cool revisit of the best seen on TV gadgets in my opinion. So just 5 of them. Let's check it out. Have you ever had to unscrew a strip screw? It's very annoying and difficult. There is a bunch of life hacks, but sometimes they don't work. Well, let's see if this gadget is going to help. I got here a few different kinds of screws. I'm just gonna shave off all this. Completely shaved off. This one's as well. Let's try to unscrew them. Nothing. You see, just spinning through. Same thing right here. Nothing. Nothing. And in the back right here, 3-step simple instruction. Drill it, flip bit, extract it. Let's see if it's actually that easy. On this end, you see this is a drill bit right here. You drill it, and then with this one, you're going to extract it. First of all, we're going to drill it. Drilled it pretty deep, as you can see. Look at that. Now we're going to take it out and put this side in. There you go. Wow, it works so easily. Let's try to do this again. Also, if one doesn't work, try different sizes. Let me try to use this thick one right here. Let's see what happens. It's probably way too thick, you see it? If one doesn't work, let's try a different one. Yeah, it's eating it really good. You see the shavings come out? Drill it all the way in, you see it? Now what we're going to do is take out. Ooh, this one is hot now. Maybe wear gloves in case it gets hot. Now, put it in. Wow! Every time. Ah, it's hot. Well guys, this thing is pretty amazing. For me, it worked the smallest one the best because
Around the UK.
Can somebody come to the door, please?
We see Britain's most resilient High Court enforcement agents.
We need immediate police assistance.
Dealing with every debtor's worst nightmare.
It's not a wake-up call most people want.
Because if you can't pay...
Doesn't have a penny, doesn't own anything.
They'll take it away. Figures from a leading debt charity show that the value of total personal debt in the UK has risen by nearly £30 billion over the first half of 2017. A third of people who took part in a recent survey have seen an increase in their debts as a result of the rising cost of living. 1 in 3 admit that they rely on credit to get by every month. High Court enforcement agents Stuart McCracken and Elmore Victor are in Whitefield, Manchester. They have a writ to collect a debt of just under £4,000 owed by former pub landlord Paul Kirsch to a firm of architects.
Let's go see if he's in. Let's hope he's in.
But this isn't the first time Stuart has tried to enforce this writ. Last time, Mr. Kirsch said he couldn't pay immediately, and so was given 24 hours to clear his debt. But he didn't pay.
Beautiful house.
Let's go, let's go. Is this what they refer to as Manchester Sunshine?
Now the agents need to get this case resolved for good, one way or another. With no answer, the agents go to investigate round the back of the house.
Hello?
Finding an open door, they make peaceful entry.
Is anybody in? Hello, Mr. Kirsch. Mr. McCracken, I can't agent.
Yeah,
I'll just stand outside. No, I'll be standing here at the moment, sir.
Please, Mr. Stand outside.
No, I'll be standing here at the moment, sir. Just regarding this issue, sir.
Please give his girlfriend out. I'm not living here.
Despite his claims, this is where the notice of enforcement has been sent to, and where Stuart met Mr. Kirsch on his previous visit. Stuart makes his position clear.
We're here now to collect a balance of £3,916. If not, we are instructed to remove goods. I'll give you 15 minutes to try and raise the funds. If not, we will have to go around the property, so to...
Opportunity to ring somebody.
Yeah, do that then, no problem.
If you're not
I'll
going to
wait.
leave the house, sit down.
I'll be waiting here,
please
sir.
give me the opportunity.
Okay, I'll give you that opportunity. I'll give you 15 minutes, sir.
No, you can't just give me 15 minutes.
I can't do, sir.
It's not my address.
Sorry, you keep saying that.
I spoke to citizens' advice.
Yeah.
You can only take things that belong
That's
to
right,
me.
sir.
Okay. This is not my television.
Right.
This is not my couch.
Okay.
This is not my house.
Yeah.
We're looking after the dogs.
Right,
Because
you
the dog's sick and he's got is ill. So I said I'd stay with the dog.
If you want to make a phone call and arrange a payment, that will be the end of the matter.
While Mr. Kirsch starts to make some calls, Stuart hunts around for evidence that the debtor is more than just the house sitter he claims to be. But Mr. Kirsch has other ideas.
How can you go wandering into another room? Can you hear what I'm saying?
I can hear what you're saying, sir,
So why
yes.
are you stopping me from making